What do you think of the Labour conference?
You really want to know? I've been coming to Labour conferences either running the bookshop here or as a journalist and broadcaster since I think 1999 was my first one. And I'm afraid this is by far and away the flattest conference I've ever been to, including Lib Dem conferences, so that shows you how bad it is. But, I mean, it's partly due to the pandemic. There aren't the numbers of people here to create that buzz that you really want at a conference. And I think some of the things that have happened have not really helped. All these rule changes, the Angela Raynham scum comment, and then yesterday Andy McDonald resigning. It just gives the impression of a party that's talking to itself, that is not. I mean, the Tories ought to be. If this was a boxing match, the Tories would be like halfway down on the canvas at the moment, and all they need is Keir Starmer to kick them in the head, and they'll be flat on the canvas. Where is he this week? He's done an interview with Andrew Marr. I've seen no other interviews that he's done. Apparently, he's not even doing any interviews with broadcast media until after the conference. Well, you can't rely on other people to send the message out for you. I'm afraid half the shadow cabinet, no one knows who they are, and they just need to get a different strategy because it's not working at the moment. I think Labour Party members want to see their shadow cabinet on the front foot taking the fight to the Tories, whereas instead they seem to be taking it to themselves. And voters don't vote for divided parties. The Tories learned that. It took them a long time to learn that, but they did learn it. And I'm afraid Labour haven't learned that lesson yet. And they also haven't learned the lessons from the 2019 election. You talk to anyone here, and they think that it was entirely Brexit that lost Labour the election. Well, as long as they continue to believe that, the Tories will be rubbing their hands with glee, because it's simply not the case. There were lots of factors. Jeremy Corbyn's one. A mad economic policy where they were spraying around promises like confetti and nobody believed that they could actually deliver on them. And I don't think that lesson has been driven home at all. It's as if, oh, well, one more heave and we'll do it next time. Well, that's not going to happen, I'm afraid. So if I was a Labour Party member, I'd be pretty disappointed at how this conference had gone. And people say, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Oh, he's a Tory and all the rest of it. Well, I can look at these things fairly dispassionately. I've been going to conferences for 37 years, Labour for 20 years. This is not one of Labour's better conferences.
Do you ever change, if we got the right leader, would you ever change from Conservative to Labour?
I don't think it's a question of changing leader necessarily. I think that Keir Starmer did a really good job up until Christmas. Up until Christmas, and I thought he'd really got what it takes. I don't know what happened since Christmas, that he's just gone off the boil. Now, that's not to say that he can't recapture the momentum that he had. Look, he was elected at a very difficult time. It's in the middle of a pandemic, and I've always cut him a lot of slack for that. But something happened at Christmas, I don't know what it was, and he just went off the boil. I think it's partly because he's not really a politician. He came into politics very late. He's not steeped in the Labour Party. I don't think he understands the Labour Party particularly well. But he needs to get some people around him who can help him get some momentum back.
Do you think, because from talks that I've been to with Corbyn, he said that he would help him and stuff. Do you think it would be in his best interest to maybe get advice from Corbyn? And
why would you want advice from the guy that lost 2 disastrous election campaigns, who took the Labour Party so far to the left that the British public thought they were unelectable? Why would you want to hear a single word from Jeremy Corbyn? I mean, okay, he's got a fan base within the Labour Party and indeed on the left outside the Labour Party. But anyone thinks that Jeremy Corbyn's got any reasonable advice to Keir Starmer, I think is deluding themselves.
What about John McDonald?
Well, I like John McDonald. I always have done. I love interviewing John McDonald. But again, I mean, he was in some way, Corbyn was. He admits he got quite a lot of things wrong in the last election campaign. I mean, I think John is trying to sort of come up with this sort of wise old uncle persona. But again, the Labour Party's got to move on from that era. It didn't work. And you have to learn the lessons from it. But apart from that, I don't see that either John McDonnell or Jeremy Corbyn have an awful lot to contribute to Keir Starmer's future.
What would you say to Keir Starmer if you could interview him?
I would say try and get yourself... You need to give of yourself a bit more. Normal people aren't particularly interested in the minutiae of Clause 4 or sort of Article 15 of the Labour Constitution. What they want to know is this guy going to be a good Prime Minister? Do I relate to him? Does he represent me? And I interviewed Keir with my good friend Jackie Smith last Christmas, and it was a 15-minute interview, and it was quite a personal interview. It's quite funny. He can be very funny. You never see that from him in his political speeches. So I would advise him to do a lot more media that is not necessarily core political, and just get your personality out there a bit more. He's clearly got an interesting personality, but people aren't seeing it at the moment.
I know he was a lawyer, but I just feel like he should have a good PR just to teach him how to.
Well,
I don't know, just be a bit
so,
human.
You know what they say, some people have got it and some people haven't, and you can't define it, but you know it when you see it. Tony Blair had it, Margaret Thatcher had it, Iain Duncan Smith didn't. It's that feeling that when someone walks in the room, do you turn your head? Does the whole room turn its head, collective head, and look at them or not? And if Keir Starmer walked around this conference now, obviously he's going to be mobbed. It's the party faithful and all the rest of it. But generally, he's not projecting a powerful image, and somehow he's got to work out how to do that. I think it's quite difficult if you're naturally a pretty reserved kind of person. It's not surprising that you sometimes maybe don't come across in the way that like Tony Blair did. And Tony Blair always affected this rather sort of shy side to his character, but you kind of knew it was a bit of an act, but everybody quite liked it. And not all leaders can do that. Bill Clinton was the same. Joe Biden hasn't got that charisma. Bill Clinton, I've never met Bill Clinton, but I know plenty of people that have. And there's just a sort of magnetism about him, which most politicians don't have.
Do you go to all the party political events?
Well, it's my job.
Oh, right.
I've always quite liked going to party conferences because you see people that you wouldn't see from one year to the next. So, and there's usually stories, there's usually lots to cover. Last night, obviously, Andy McDonald resigned just before we went on air, so that gave the programme a bit of extra fizz. We got various people. I like doing outside broadcasts, and I am a political animal. You can never, although I'm not active politically anymore, you never quite lose the political bug. It's impossible to sort of excise it from your brain. Would I go to party conferences if I wasn't paid to? I don't know is the honest answer to that one. I think, as I said, I've been going to Tory conferences since 1985. I used to go to Lib Dem conferences up until, I think, 2015, when they basically got eviscerated. I quite like Lib Dem conferences because they actually mean something. They form policy, whereas the Tory conference is now essentially a rally or a convention, and Labour conference is a bit the same now. Well, it certainly was under Blair.
What about the Green Party?
I have never been to a Green Party conference, and I frankly can't see myself ever going.
What's your opinion of Angela Raynham and what she did?
Well, she's got form, hasn't she? And that she did it in the House of Commons, called a Tory MP scum, and the Deputy Speaker made her apologise for it. I thought that was a bit confected, all of the anger over that. It's a party conference, she was speaking at a fringe meeting. Politicians sometimes get a bit carried away, speaking to the party faithful. I couldn't really get excited about it. Although, having said that, I did write a book called Why Can't We All Just Get Along, which was advocating much more polite political discourse. So I suppose I ought to be very annoyed. Look, there are so few characters in politics nowadays, and she is certainly a character. And I don't want a German-style politics where it's incredibly boring, it's incredibly grey. On the other hand, I don't want gratuitous sort of name-calling, I suppose. There is a happy medium there somewhere. And when you have people like Laura Pidcock saying, I could never be friends with a Tory, a little bit of me died when I heard her say that, because I thought, you don't actually get what politics is all about. Because if you want to achieve things in politics, you can't necessarily just do it through your own party, particularly when you're in opposition. If you're a constituency MP and you've got a campaign that you want to run to change the law, well, why wouldn't you want to get people from other parties on side? And most MPs actually rub along quite nicely in the House of Commons. In public, they'll sort of lambast each other, but in private, they will sit down and have a drink, have a meal. they're not going to get on with everybody. Who does? But I just think if you think that the Tories are your mortal enemy, that kind of says more about you than it does anything. And it's the same with, I'm sure there are people in the Conservative Party who would say, well, couldn't possibly talk to anyone who's Labour. Well, if you don't engage with your political opponents and at least make an effort to understand their arguments, how can you marshal your own arguments? It stands to reason. If you don't listen to other people, you're not going to be able to argue your case as well as you could if you did. And we've got to a stage now in our public discourse where I think some people don't even believe that the other side has a right to an opinion. And the Brexit debate was a case in point there, where on both sides you had people who essentially thought, no, I'm right. It's so obvious that I'm right. Those people are stupid, or they're thick, or they're racist, or they're traitors to Britain because they want to remain in the EU. I mean, it was on both sides of the argument, and I'm so glad we're not having that debate anymore. That it is more or less over because it was just so toxic, and I've never come across an issue. And the nearest one I suppose in my adult life was nuclear disarmament in the 1980s, where you had both unilateralists, multilateralists, both absolutely convinced that they were right, and never the twain shall meet. Well, things are sometimes a shade of grey rather than black and white.
Think to the Batley campaign, with George Galloway and what went off there.
So George Galloway is an interesting case in that if George Galloway came up now, he and I would have a perfectly friendly, reasonable debate. But he's toxic in politics, and the kind of politics that he promotes, which is not about bringing people together, it's about creating division. I'm afraid I have no time for whatsoever. It's a shame because as a broadcaster, he's very talented. But I don't know, there's a side to him that is deeply dark, and it's a shame because
is that always there, or?
I think it's always been there to an extent. But it's like, look, politicians are no more bad than any other sector of society. Believe it or not, there are evil nurses, there are evil teachers, there are evil journalists. In all sectors of society, there are bad apples, and you have bad apples in politics, and that will always be the case. You can't expect, okay, people say, well, politicians are leaders, they ought to be better than that. Well, okay, you can make that argument, but as I said, they're human beings too, and in the end, human beings do bad things sometimes.